first have a chance to talk a little bit about sort of elephant in the room. Our theme is closing the affordability gap, design, cost strategies, and of course the supply chain. And of course, when we think about these things, we're looking at, government and policy and some of the social issues and whatnot that, are very relevant, but certainly beyond our control. So I'm going to open the floor up and kind of just get the conversation going with ideas from our panelists, of course, on some ideas surrounding, what will work instead of what won't work. And so we're going to kind of look at, design cost from a developer standpoint, how we make it happen. And then we are going to kind of progress from there. So gentlemen, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to hit on some of the hot button topics first.
Todd, take it away.
Oh, me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just did a little research this morning, and the four of us talked a little bit last week too. But just to give some background, we have a huge housing unit deficit in this country. Some estimates up to 7 million units, and it's a problem all over the country, and certainly in California where we are. And just maybe to segue into some of the barriers and solutions. One thing I just read this morning, I think it's been published recently nationally, that some of the housing units in California are costing over $1 million a unit to build, and that's for an apartment unit, and that's absolutely insane. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Not the least of being a bureaucracy and regulations and things that make it unattractive for developers to go into the market.
Yeah. So in New York, it's interesting, right? New York, everything is interesting. You're very condensed, a lot of population, and we're millions of units short for affordable housing. And the question of affordable could be actually subjective in and of itself, because affordable to who? Right? So all these developers that build these high-end condos and co-ops or whatever they wind up turning into legally, that's obviously not affordable, so it really comes down to, we don't like to use the word projects or even NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, stuff of that nature, but those buildings are all derelict and falling apart as well. So you have a combination of existing units that are housing people that are not up to par. And the governor was trying to get 9% increase over the next 3 years, just to get more housing. And one of the things from my standpoint that I see is on the development side. If it doesn't make sense financially for anybody to do it, whether it's private partnership with public entity or whether it's all private, if the numbers don't make sense, there's no vested interest to do any of this stuff. So I think, one of the things that a solution-oriented base is, there has to be some incentive for people to want to put up the money to actually go through with some of these projects. And so they don't cost $1 million a unit to build, which obviously is cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
And I think too, there's more in my realm, in San Diego, housing's ridiculously expensive, as is rent. And so the current mayor is on a really, really hard push to increase density. But what is happening in San Diego particularly is they've relaxed the regulations on how to increase density pretty substantially and significantly. So then we're going to start experiencing sort of unintended consequences, but not unforeseen consequences. There are a lot of people that are trying to get his ear and get him to understand that what he's doing is very problematic. And the big push for him is what we call ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, basically previously known as granny flats. But what the city of San Diego is allowing, ultimately you could take a single family residence, doesn't need to be a huge lot, but a big enough lot, and you could put 4 2-story, 30-foot tall ADUs in the backyard. No rear or side yard setbacks, no off-street parking, no developer fees for infrastructure, and within a mile of transit. And all of that is is not going to work well, to say the least. And in terms of the affordability gap, there's a recent example of a home where this happened. So ultimately, the single family home was purchased for 22% above asking price. It was a 1.1 million for a 1,500 square foot 1950s home. And 4 ADUs are going in the backyard. The house is being turned into rental. I think 3 of the units need to be affordable, but that's going to be at like $2,300 a month. And what happens is you pull a home off the market. So number one, you're taking away homes that people can buy, and you're also essentially increasing the cost of rent, even at what's considered affordable. So it's one of those things that this affordability thing is in fact something that needs to be paid attention to and solutions come up with. But unfortunately, I think what happens on the political side, they come up with their plans and then they just want to say what they've accomplished, even if it isn't accomplishing what they set out to.
From our perspective, for our firm, what we've been seeing as a trend is obviously densification, but not only densification in the obvious places like large established cities, but also sort of these secondary cities. One, real estate prices tend to be a little bit lower. Land availability is there. But also what's interesting is when you start to develop these, call them sort of mid-market developments, where you're building around, let's say, an established high street, an area where there's some retail, or there's some walkability areas there. In Seattle, you see a lot of that happening. Some of it's being spurred on by transit. They're building a pretty extensive transit system throughout this area. So some of the suburban areas, you're starting to see sort of town centers pop up and so forth. What's interesting about those opportunities, one, is that it lets the market, real estate market, sort of go to places that aren't so-called discovered or aren't overpriced yet. But the challenge there, and I know we don't want to talk too much about government, but the challenge there is local governments or local authorities allowing those types of developments to happen, higher density. And I think what's nice about those types of developments too, they tend to be a scale that's more sort of market driven, at the same time provides a sense of density and placemaking that I think a lot of people want. Because I think part of the issue is not only building the housing, but making sure it's serviced properly. In other words, it's not causing the strain on the transit systems, or you have access to services. The important part though also is that depending on the size of the communities you're building, schools and other healthcare access, all those things become important as well. So it's not just the housing itself, it's also the community around it. But one thing I basically would say is that where I see a lot of hope is sort of these sort of higher density developments in smaller communities or smaller neighborhoods, I think is a way we're leaving it.
Yeah, I don't think we can get around higher density and, going up taller and more dense, but even smaller units too. I mean, there's a culture in this country compared to Europe of having, people expect much larger units. They have a lot more stuff. And, but I think the holistic approach, Bob was in on it too, that you can't create this additional density without having the infrastructure to support it. It's just not going to work. The negative consequences are going to be huge. One other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and we have this here in San Diego, and that's NIMBYism, right? I mean, a lot of people, even though they might, be promoting affordable housing, they're not interested in having it in their community. And this is true for some of the coastal communities here in San Diego. And so even though Sacramento is pressing, applying pressure to all the big cities, it doesn't necessarily, filter down to the small communities, and which it needs to. It needs to be a broad acceptance of this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge, but there are different sort of directions you have to approach it. The NIMBYism, what they're doing in San Diego is they're taking neighborhoods that are zoned, single family residential, and they're upzoning them so to increase the density. So you take like I said, you take a 1,500 square foot home, and now you upzone it, you do the ADUs, you now have 12 units on that property. And that's allowed to happen because it's within 1 mile of transit. So it's kind of interesting too, because it's like, in some ways, to me, it almost seems discriminatory to the people that have the single family residences that they purchased when it was zoned single family, but just because they're within a mile of transit, now their neighborhood gets upzoned while others don't. So there's just all these factors that start playing into it, you know. And NIMBYism is a big part of it, but you know, in Southern California, people love their single family homes,
Sure.
and have invested a lot in them. So it's just a challenge.
In New York City, you can go, and I've done this before. I worked on a project at Broadmoor on the Upper West Side. Then I had another project on Central Park West. I literally had to go from basically a $2 million apartment, walk through an area that, let's just say, is affordable housing that was not very safe. And when I got to the other side, there's $2-3 million apartments. So you have neighboring, literally, you know, some, you know, different types of people. And I mean, the city itself in New York is moving every direction. There's only so many square feet of buildable area. So they tried pushing it out to the islands a little bit. And, you know, whatever there's space to build, it's in the, you know, they try to find a way to make the most money, right? And I think developers, you know, have to also change the way they look at things a little bit, to not be driven just by, you know, how much money I can make for a piece of land. I think that if there's more urban planning involved and more like systems involved and infrastructure involved, whether it be utilities that are needed to service these additional people or incentives of some sort, you know, I mean, if you add more people, you need more water, you need more gas, you need more sewers, you need more roads, you need just more electricity. You know, these things are all necessary if we're going to make any more of these high density areas work.
So gentlemen, we're talking about, you know, the making high density areas work and whatnot. Talk to me a little bit about some of the ethical, you know, when we're looking at, you know, design practices and potentially moving that direction. You know, what's kind of at the forefront of your mind in that regard?
If you don't mind, I'll that's part of it.
Yeah.
I think part of the key thing that will help control costs on projects as well is, we talked about this earlier, is sort of more of an integrated design approach. We talk about an integrated design approach, it's really having all the right stakeholders at the table at the very beginning of the projects. Most of the time on private development projects, developers are obviously taking a lot of risks. They don't necessarily have the money to invest to bring a contractor on board and the architect on board at the same time, or a project management company on board. But we've discovered in our experience, it really helps so much in terms of right sizing a project, as well as making the right assumptions on cost, but also, especially in this day and age, where there's such a shortage of materials or unpredictability of materials, having an ability to sort of have those questions asked early in the process. So it's more of a process proposition that in the design and development of projects, that you really try to have a comprehensive team to sort of define those risks and how to mitigate those. Because there's nothing worse than an architect coming on board, designing something that can't be built, or it's too expensive, or having a builder come on board and design something, but not take into consideration planning requirements or other market conditions that might help the project viability. So I think it's one of the things that as a committee we talked about would be really important, is sort of looking at how the process can be set up properly, so that you're able to control the cost and also deal with all the unpredictability of materials and logistics.
Yeah, I think
Those are some excellent points. I appreciate that comment, Sean. When I say we, my name's John, last name is Wiz, work for my own firm, Wizco, and we specialize in working with owners and developers and helping manage and mitigate costs on projects. And so you're speaking my language, Sean. And Ross, I wanted to go back to a comment you made about developers not chasing the almighty buck. I mean, that sounds great, but in reality, it's difficult. What I'm finding is that a lot of this stuff has to be, if they want to develop something, a lot of cities are making, particularly in the multifamily high density projects, the cities are making a minimum requirement for some of those units to include affordable housing, if you will, for low income type folks. But it's difficult to tell a developer, hey, we need you to do X, Y, and Z. And at the end of the day, the numbers don't quite pencil out, as you alluded to. It sounds like a great idea. I don't have a solution, but I do know that in working with the whole cost control and cost mitigation process, there's a lot of things in there that can be done to quote unquote pull some of the excess fat out of it, this constructability, value engineering, a lot of things that we look at. And then you're just basic issues that we deal with on a regular basis, which is fraud, abuse, overcharges, overbilling, stuff like that. So there's a number of tools, but it's certainly not a one size fits all, but a lot of good points. I'm really enjoying the dialogue.
Yeah, back to Sean's point a little bit about putting the team together at the front end. That is critically important for, honestly, for the success of a project. We've all become specialists. You know, there was a day and time in construction where, you know, architects built and builders designed and all of that, but those days are pretty much gone. So everybody's a specialist now. And if you don't bring the team together and collaborate from the beginning, there are going to be lots of sort of misstarts and things. Value engineering is just part and parcel of what I do anymore, particularly when clients have hired architects or designers, you know, sort of separately and didn't include the builder. Again, it's just a matter of the knowledge base that each, you know, sort of professional has needs to come together to achieve, you know, what the client's sort of, you know, dreams are, but also based on their budget. And that's another thing that we run into occasionally, not so much anymore, but is there needs to be that budget, you know, real budget conversation at the front end.
Yeah,
as well.
what's it really gonna cost?
Yeah. Because there's nothing worse than like Sean said, you know, people spending a lot of time doing amazing design just to find out that it's significantly beyond budget and now it has to be undesigned. And that process is not fun.
Going back to your question though, Ashley, I think Todd could probably speak well to this. You know, lower cost housing or affordable housing doesn't mean bad design. And I think especially, you know, Todd, with your experience living in Europe, especially Northern Europe, you know, design quality doesn't have to be necessarily expensive, but there's a lot to be said about that, which I think leads to, you know, higher density projects and projects that are a little bit more, say the word, you know, a little bit more simple in their approach. But I mean, Todd, you had experience in Europe with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think both the barriers and the solutions here are multifaceted. And one thing we talked about last week was the need to look at international references. What are the other countries doing? And Denmark has a world-renowned social housing policy. And they do some things over there that are a lot different than what we do here. And one thing they do is they're really good at adaptive reuse of the existing building stock. And that's partly because there's very little land. And I think when we think about affordable housing, we tend to think about new buildings, you know, somewhere on the outskirts of town or wherever they can fit in, right? But there are a lot of vacant buildings. And I think with the commercial real estate crisis and, you know, office space crisis
And retail.
we're having now, I mean, there's an obvious fit here for maybe adaptive reuse of some of these office buildings to housing. It's also good, you know, from an environmental sustainability point of view to reuse what you have. Another thing they do is a much simpler process. It's much more streamlined. And while I agree, we have to partner and we have to partner up front. Some of these American developers, I think they have to go to like 20 different sources to patch together financing for a project. Whereas in Denmark, it's primarily, you know, government-backed low interest loans that is the primary financing, and it's all much simpler and streamlined. And then they're much more open to co-op housing and different structures for housing units. Here we have rental and we have you know, owned housing, condos and that sort of thing, but they're good at that. And especially to Ashley's question about ethics and such, we have a stigma we need to destigmify the, you know, what we call affordable housing or social housing here. And they're really good over there at mixing tenant types and income levels within a single project. And And I think that's something we could do more of here. I mean, that we do that to some degree. There's like these 80-20% mixes of 20% have to be affordable and 80% market rate sort of things. But so there's some good things there. And then finally, as you say, Sean, the design, I mean, design is at least half of the equation here. We have all the logistical problems, but we also have design challenges. And over there, they're really good at high density, low rise housing where they create really engaging, very high quality interior and exterior spaces between the buildings. And we need good architects. We need good architecture to create buildings that are both affordable, but having extremely high value for their investment in terms of what they provide experientially and functionally for tenants and owners.
Great. I was just reading through some of the questions to try to catch some of these while they're relevant. I'm sorry, it just somehow booted me off of Zoom just a second ago, so I was just able to jump back on. I'm kind of going through some of those. I think it might be an interesting time, as we're watching the clock, to look at some of the supply chain issues that we've discussed. So, availability of materials, labor, obviously, there's some market volatility that has certainly made its way to the forefront as well.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, in New York or probably other places too, we're running out of qualified skilled labor. Like it's forgetting unions, forgetting non-union, forget open shop, forgetting prevailing wage, actual qualified electricians, plumbers, iron workers, carpenters, like skilled tradesmen is a lost art. Try to find someone to do Venetian plaster or one of those high-end finishes now, it's nearly impossible. And I think that some focus has to be put on that everyone doesn't need to have a 4-year degree. Everyone doesn't need to be a doctor and a lawyer. And you can be very happy just being a plumber, being an electrician, do very well, have a great life, have a great family, not be as stressed as some of the people who pick fields with higher education degrees. Because I'm 44 and I already see a problem with finding qualified people. So I can't imagine it getting any better without some trade schools or teaching or a push in the world to actually skilled labor.
Yeah, there's no pathway for a career in the trades anymore. Certainly not in California anyhow. And it's very frustrating because staffing is our biggest, probably our single biggest issue. We just can't find people, and we can't find good people, unfortunately. So yeah, some kind of pathway into the trades would be extremely helpful. And yeah, there was a time when the unions provided that quite a bit, but depending on where you are, strength of unions now is pretty minimal compared to what it used to be. I'm not saying that's good or bad, it just is. But that used to be a great pathway into the trades, and now there's pretty much nothing. All of the industrial arts I know were gutted out of the schools in California years ago. And so, youth aren't exposed to, even the possibility of sort of a career in the trades. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, it's not limited to the US either. I know in Denmark and Europe, they're having the same problem. The trade schools are not, they want 4 or 5 year degrees, right? So, but I have heard that the trade schools are doing better here in the US now, and more people are going that route.
There's been a push, a conscientious effort to try to, force you, whether either governmental or incentivize the fact that, there needs to be training. Like you don't become a master electrician the first day on the job, or a master plumber. Those things take years of experience and knowledge, and you got to start at some point. If you don't start, you're never going to get done. That's for sure.
That's right.
So one of the areas that we also talked about is prefabrication. That's not an answer to labor shortages necessarily, but we've been running across different projects with different types of prefabrication. So most people think of prefabrication as an entire building. Sometimes it's components like a kitchen or a bathroom or a certain room, like a dormitory room or a hospital room. But we've been asked to, on a couple of projects, look at prefabrication, excuse me. And it sounds really good, but I think there's some challenges there, especially how projects are financed. Sometimes it's not acceptable. housing and things like that. But prefabrication has a lot of promise. And it's been done at different scales. But I think that in the US, there's definitely prefabrication going on in certain components. But if you look at other industries, prefabrication is really where the future is, especially if you're talking about automation. But right now, I think that prefabrication has been utilized in some areas, but I don't think it really has taken off as far as it could potentially with housing, especially.
Yeah, it's a very, very small percentage of what's built. There's a project in San Diego that started not too long ago. It's a 5-story multifamily. And they're using modular on it, which I think is pretty fascinating. One of the things that it really helps it with is the build time frame. So it reduces the build time frame like a lot.
Yeah.
So you see units go up very, very rapidly. One of the challenges though is finding factories that are doing it and doing it well, and then you have a lot of shipping issues because you're moving pretty large components, sometimes pretty great distances.
Yeah, I have a lot of desert clients that approach me and say, let's do a prefab or something. And we look at a few systems or whatever, whether they're flat pack or box systems. And it ends up not penciling out. And I mean, wood frame construction is still, it's still cheaper per square foot for a basic sort of, project.
I have a project in New York that the owner wanted, it's a residential project, a 120 by 80 lot. He was looking at prefab. And I was like, okay, we can look at it, but I don't know if the town of Oyster Bay is gonna like it. I don't know how everything is gonna, intertwine very well. And I don't know what, you're not gonna get X, Y, and Z. And by the time we ran all the numbers, like you said, it didn't make sense. Like, it just didn't make sense to fabricate something, in Pennsylvania in pieces, then bring it to the site, try to make sure the foundation is lined up and everything works, when I can just do stick frame, pour my own concrete and call it a day. And it's done pretty quickly. So I think that's a challenge definitely with the whole modular world. And I did on the other side though, on the flip side, in New York City, when they do some of these curtain walls, those curtain wall systems, there the modular actually works very, very, very well. Like the facades of the building, they can drop those in with those clips rather quickly.
Exactly.
So I guess the application use also makes a difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, partial prefab can work pretty well too. There's some steel systems out there that are pretty good. I've seen a couple in the desert as well that is partial prefab.
Great. So we've got a couple of other questions that I think might be interesting to loop into the conversation here. We've talked about, supplies, availability of materials, and of course, labor being the big one, design practices and such. But in terms of how that parlays into, financing and some partnerships and whatnot that might be available, for the development and delivery of projects. What are you gentlemen, using or kind of working towards to that point?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so we've talked about, supply chain, labor, the density, and of course, integrated design. An interesting aspect that I think would be good to loop in here would be, the financing and kind of how that plays into these particular topics as well. We touched on in our previous conversation some of the public and private partnerships for financing and development and delivery of those projects. What does that look like? How are you guys using that? The role that that's playing and kind of where we're at in our current market.
From what I'm seeing is there needs to be more partnership on any level, whether it be the city, whether it be the state, whether it be the federal, whoever it may, whatever entity is willing to give an inch, I think needs to give an inch, because, developers in New York, like as Mr. What's his name, as John has pointed out, they're so bottom line driven that to actually, try to convince somebody who has land and has money to build something that's not going to make them the most amount of money it's a battle you can't win. So if in Denmark, these low interest loans work, I definitely think that there are solutions out there, and we have to think outside the box, because You need affordable housing, and we haven't really created a way, at least in New York, to my knowledge, of finding a system that once you come up with a model that works, you can probably just, rinse, repeat. But until you come up with that first model that makes sense, that's the real challenge right now.
Right. Yeah, actually, I really don't have a lot of personal experience. I'm doing custom homes primarily, but I would think that, to follow on Ross's comment, if the FHA or a national based, housing association could maybe take a lead and try to simplify and create something that, I like decentralization, but something for the country, I like guidelines for the country, because it just seems to be chaotic now and overly complex in general. And that's why developers stay away, and it just doesn't pencil out for them, right?
I've been
Yeah, I joke now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the so-called show called Shark Tank, where all these investors sit around and people come in with their ideas. And my favorite comment and quote I hear from that show often is when Mr. Wonderful comes to the table and says, 5% hardly gets me out of bed in the morning. So, people are so profit driven that if it doesn't pencil out, then they're not excited about it, and they're not looking to make it work.
Mhm.
And that's a challenge across the board.
I've been involved in a project right now, and I can't reveal where it is and what it is because it's right now confidential. But it involves a large public investment into a transit-oriented development. And what's interesting about that is the developer really built the case to show that the tax benefits, new tax benefits, would more than pay for the investment from the state. And as much as that math works, and even through COVID, it's still from public perception. There's always the sense that, well, government's putting money into something. Whereas I think part of the story for investors, it depends on the scale of the project, is also, a long-term value. And government does have a role. I know we don't want to talk too much about politics, but government does have a role sometimes on projects where they are the ones who can take the long-term view of something. As long as there's a payback to the state or to the public entity, then it makes sense. But they can take a longer-term view of these types of investments, which then allows private investment to come in and develop things. But transit is probably one of the key elements that will really start to help. And I know that I grew up in California, so I know the whole issue about how people look at mass transit there, and unfortunately that die has been cast. But I think transit and other infrastructure elements help sort of spur on development or allow for investments in neighborhoods to improve districts. I was involved in a project, this is my previous firm, for a master plan for the Mayo Clinic, and the developer project management company was able to extract about, I think, $700 million from the state of Minnesota. But what that money was earmarked for was for improvement of transit, bus transit, not anything in terms of rail, building proper parking infrastructure, improving roads, and putting in infrastructure to allow the Mayo Clinic to start to develop a research campus, which would be open to more private development. It also was to build mixed-use developments or provide land for mixed-use developments, because the Mayo Clinic has a problem about attracting talent. I mean, the top medical facility in the world, basically, but they have a hard time attracting people to Rochester, Minnesota, especially in the middle of winter. So the developer was able to convince the state that the tax benefits of investing in a place like that would pay off. And what that allowed is for private developers now to come in and utilize parcels or to bid on parcels in which to be able to create the developments that they need, be it research facilities or housing facilities and whatnot. But I think there is a role for government to provide those catalyst projects, then let the free market come in and sort of do its thing.
Good. Sean, I want to transition over, and this will be a good segue here. We're talking about the affordability, and I think there's this element of culture and whatnot too that we bring in, and it addresses Larry's question that he had put in the chat, and he mentioned that maybe, Todd, this is directed at you, although I know all of our panelists today, you've got a ton of experience with this as well, handling the difference between someone who's used to managing high-end home investments and someone that gets more of the affordable house or housing and isn't able to mesh the two or the areas a mix of values. He mentioned he's done several projects and buildings. So, two bad owners can affect the whole building, of course. So on a larger scale, how do you manage the culture and the shift in terms of, the cost?
I'm not sure this relates to what you were saying, but this idea of maybe on the cultural side of a feeling of ownership. And you just said something like two bad owners could wreck a project or something like that, right? I think that again goes back to design. If you can create through design, spaces that promote pride and a sense of ownership, even though you may not own the unit, right? A sense of belonging and a sense of being part of a community. You can do that to some degree through design.
I get,
Go
so I've seen a few different things. So, it's with a condo complex, it's a lot of owners in a small building, and
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Larry.
that can affect, a couple owners can affect a building of 200 owners. The other thing that you guys talked about a little bit is it seems like these towns, which like on the perimeter of Chicago, have gone into some of these projects maybe in advance before the mass transit gets there, and they put up brownstones or they put in this housing, and they put it on as many units as they can on this lot. So the garage basically leads up to the next floor, to the next floor, to the next floor, or whatever. And they'll sell one or two and they'll subsidize them, and they can't sell the rest of them. And they basically end up giving the first test 32 units away because they didn't design it right. There's been a lot of failures in the suburbs that I've seen like that. And now I'm seeing in Northwest Indiana where they're starting to do the same things that we did in the suburbs or others have done in the suburbs. So I really like the way you guys are directing this toward good design and whatever. The finance is driving part of this into bad design and failures. I'm not sure how to get past that, but in Chicago, I haven't seen any good examples of the mix where you guys are going with this. It all has to work. It has to be financially viable. It has to be something you're proud of. People are so used to having their own space, even if it's 1,500 square feet, that when you get 1,500 square feet stacked up 3 floors, it doesn't work. So anyway, or it's not accessible or whatever. So I guess I'm just talking from my experience in Chicago and the suburbs over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, New York is probably similar to Chicago in that way. I think of the big main city, right? Then you have the suburbs on the outside.
Right.
And what's been going on literally over the past couple of weeks is the political aspect of it, of the state versus local, who's in charge, who's gonna blink first. And in order to get the budget approved, we all agree that something needs to be done, but in terms of how to actually do it, that's where the real challenge is. That's the real challenge, Larry, because we know what doesn't work, like you just said. You've seen what doesn't work, and we almost have to look at these examples of areas that's failed to figure out what will work. And just like George Costanza, if every instinct you have is right, is wrong, then the opposite must be correct. Some of that logic.
Right. And
Larry, I was going to say, Larry, Chicago is my original hometown, west suburb of Wheaton, so I can relate to what you're talking about.
Okay.
But from my experience, I was going to simply share this. I'm going to slightly disagree with what Ross said about New York being similar to Chicago. Yes, from a large city standpoint, but working with a lot of the nation's largest multifamily developers who pride themselves on working in cities with high barriers to entry, the New Yorks, the Bostons, the San Franciscos, Los Angeles, Seattle, high barriers to cost entry. All of these developers have chosen to not develop in Chicago. I'm not sure why. For years, they're developing everywhere but Chicago. Chicago is unique in that it's a very, according to these high profile developers, I'm talking about the Avalon Bays, the Equity Residentials, the former Archstone communities, and several others. They just can't figure out how to make things work in Chicago. So it has its own unique constraints and circumstances and problems. I don't have the answer, but I know that I've asked that question multiple times, and Chicago's just a unique animal.
I'm working on a project right now that's taken, what, 6 years now to still get the approval process finalized.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Crazy.
It's just different in Chicago, and a lot of people just are staying away. Obviously, people are developing in Chicago, but it's not your name brand folks necessarily.
They're probably smart for doing so, but it's painful to watch because, the projects are all money driven and there's not very many successful projects. If they put all the affordable stuff in one building, it fails. If they try to do mixed use, it fails. And if they try and put it in a neighborhood that's not similar, it fails. So anyway, I'm just listening intently. I appreciate all the input and I'm just talking from 46 years in Chicago. So.
Right. Well, you've seen a lot in 46 years.
Wealth of experience also. All right, Michael, you have been ever so patient. I hope we haven't jumped from one to the next. Oh, I think we're having maybe a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get closer.
There you go.
All right. Sorry about that. I have a new camera that's I'm used to. So I have about 30 plus years of consulting experience in art and mostly in the development industry. So I'm going to give just 60 seconds of what I think is good news. We've heard a lot about the challenges, and I think that's it's really important to highlight. But I'd like to highlight 2 projects that I actually think work. In Massachusetts, we have what is called Home Rule, which is 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and each one of them controls their own development. There's no county system here. There's no very few state mandates up until recently for housing. And what they did in 1969, sorry about the history lesson, but we have something called 40B, which allows developers to bypass the zoning restrictions if they provide a certain amount of affordable housing mixed in their development, which is 20 or 25% depending on the development. And it's produced a modest amount of inventory in this area. I've worked on a bunch of these projects. I've got one now in a very Coney suburban sort of ex-urban location in Massachusetts. And the difference that this project has made, because I've seen a lot of very, very contentious battles over this one is sailing through because this developer eased off on the density a little bit, is providing more green space. Okay, this is the landscape architect talking. So, but everybody loves this project. We've got 200 units going up on, I think it's 38 acres, and very few people are coming to these public hearings and voicing concern about this. And that's because, aside from the good design, that these towns know that they need to meet a certain threshold of affordability in order to reject these projects. So if you have 10% or more of what is considered affordable housing, you can reject the project. If you have less than 10%, the developer can come in and basically force the project down your throat, as long as the state approves it, and you go in with a higher density. So this project is going to sail through, and it's probably the first time that I've ever seen one sail through so quickly. So that's a really, really encouraging. The other project that I'm doing is in a much more urban location. It's in the city of Boston, which has an extremely rigorous design review. And the neighbors are very, very savvy. They come out, they're very organized, and these are pitched battles. This particular project, I have never in my whole professional experience come up to a situation where we have neighbors coming in and saying, there's not enough housing in this development, give us more. We have a housing crisis. We don't have enough affordable units. My kids can't afford to stay here. So in that one, it is the steady drumbeat, at least around here, of the housing crisis is sinking in. it's sinking in. People are hearing the message and they get it. And, you know, whether it's the Tony suburb or the in-town location, we have two projects that are, you know, they're, you know, it's not easy, it's taking a little bit of time, but they're definitely going to be approved. And, but then again, there's the question of it having to, you know, penciling out, as we've always said. I'll say one more thing, and that Bob, I also have a biology degree as an undergraduate degree before I went to design school.
Excellent.
Going to be an ecologist.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Alex had a question previously about and this a little bit on the periphery, but working from home, that trend, right? Is this new design, right, taking into account, you know, some of the work from home that is happening, or a lot of work from home that is happening? So we're looking at, you know, new builds and such, you know, is new design and whatnot really taking that into account in terms of space and so on?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read a lot of articles, both from Denmark and from the US about that, where residential design is being transformed by that. And it's all the way from architects down to suppliers. My wife's a contract textile designer that is commercial textiles, but they're branching into more residential because office space is kind of going down and home working is going up, or remote working is going up. So absolutely, it's changing things a lot, and it will change affordable housing as well.
A great connection there. That's perfect. Thank you. And then Joanne, you had a question about, you know, sort of the forecast for the short-term rentals, and then the
Oh, it's built for rent.
yes, built for rent, some of the single family rentals as well. That's right.
It's not short term. It's a development, just single family homes, but they're for rent. I don't know if any of you are following that trend, and what's your opinion? What's your forecast?
I'm not familiar with it.
I mean, most of the stuff I'm doing is the residential stuff I'm doing is for the actual homeowner, whether it's a complete knockdown or an add. So I cannot speak towards that question.
Yeah, I mean, we've always had single family homes for rent. I mean, throughout San Diego, you can rent a house, but I think there needs to be a lot more of that, so that we get more variety and flexibility and the offerings for that sort of thing. But you mentioned one thing, like Airbnb and a lot of these.
No, it's not Airbnb. It's like a whole place, a whole community created, but they are built for rent, not for purchase.
Long term.
So
Yeah.
Joanne, you're talking about a new development
Well,
of single family homes.
Yeah, single family homes. The
My
single
experience
family
of that was something that had related to the market. When the market crashed in 2009, we designed this is my previous firm, a really high-end condominium tower in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills. And the market crashed completely, and they turned it into from, you know, selling units to basically rental units. I've seen that happening in regards to developers trying to just keep their options open, depending on the market. But I'm interested to hear more about that in terms of who the investors are, because I think that would be the clue. Is it an institutional investor or a foreign investor who's doing that?
Yeah, private equity.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to be introduced to this expert in the field, I will be happy to make an introduction.
Yeah.
And I have another call at 1 o'clock, so I have to go. Thank you so much for your.
Well, Joanne, before you jump off, I just put the contact list in the chat. So take a second to snap that. I think this is probably a good point. You know, we are rounding out our hour together. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but that contact list that I just put in the chat, if you can fill that out, that will ensure that we get you everyone's contact information who was on the call today. That way you can reach out with any additional questions or follow up. I really appreciate everyone jumping on here today. A big thank you to our panelists who, you know, took out extra time to meet with me and to go through some questions and things, and then for all of the insights that you offered today as well. We really appreciate it.